every time there's a stressful situation about food, it's giving the child, whereas before the child didn't have a food issue, the child had a sensory issue that was just coming up when they ate. And rather than managing the sensory issue, we treat it as a food issue, and we pressure the child to eat. Every time we do that, we're giving the child a bigger and bigger food issue that they didn't have at the beginning.
So Guy, I know that we've talked a lot about this, you and I, in the past, and I every day am reminded of how much stress and anxiety parents can have around food and eating. For children in general, right? Parents always have a lot of, food is love. Food means so many deep and powerful things for all of us. But when parents have a neurodivergent or an autistic child who doesn't seem to be eating as they would like, who seems to have very specific food preferences or aversions to certain foods, parents can start to feel incredibly anxious and insecure and afraid about eating in mealtime with their children. So I think that this can be a tremendous, not only source of strain and stress within families, but parents sometimes, again, don't have access to good support around what to do and how to navigate this whole world of eating and feeding in mealtime with their children. So I wonder if that's not also something that you see in your own experience and the families and professionals that you've talked to as well.
It is. And I'm interested, what do you think is going on? Because there's a school of thought that, some parents might feel that the child is being manipulative with their eating and trying to use it as a power mechanism to try and get their own way. Is there anything in that?
Yeah, that's a really powerful question. I think that like everything else, I think there's always a bit of truth in when we think about it from the perspective of when we broaden the perspective beyond autistic children, that children are always going to do what they, in their minds, need to do to be able to eat the kinds of foods that they want to eat. Mm-hmm. Right. And I did that as a child. I'm sure you had your own version of that as a child, right? I didn't want to eat peas or, vegetables or the stuff that, my parents in many ways were kind of forcing me to eat. I didn't like the way that it tasted or smelled, or I mean, I'm making a funny face because I can literally call back the memories of how much I could not stand eating mushy peas. And I was forced to. My parents would not let me get up from the table, for example, when I wouldn't eat my peas, or I wouldn't get dessert, or whatever it was. So I think that what, to your question, all children want to eat what they want to eat and don't want to eat what they don't want to eat. And so is that manipulative? I suppose we could see it, from that perspective, but I think what's so important to recognize for autistic and neurodivergent children is that they can have a much more complex situation in terms of their central nervous system and their bodies and their sensory sensitivities and preferences that can be much more heightened than a neurotypical child. So all of us have our own sensory preferences and sensitivities. Some of us like crunchy foods, some of us like softer foods, some of us like foods with intense flavors, some of us like food that's more, less intensely flavored. So textures and colors and, food that's either chewy or crunchy. And so the reason why I bring all of that up is because what we continue to learn about autistic people is that some of these sensory preferences and sensitivities can be so intense and strong that literally people can have um, um, intense reactions, including, you know, what am I trying to say? Heaving or gag reflex that can happen in response to a certain food smell or texture or taste. And interestingly, all babies go through that period too. You know, babies are tasting food and testing out food, and ooh, do I like this texture? Do I like this smell? No. Ooh, oh, I like it. No, I don't like it. So earlier in all of our development, we went through these kinds of stages around experiencing food on a sensory level. But because, again, we know that autistic people can have some much more intense responses to certain foods, it's that much more important for parents to really understand that pushing and forcing their kids to eat particular foods, even if we know, you know, nutrition wise, they are good for a child, can have some really, really, I think, some really negative unintended consequences.
Yeah. Tell us a bit about those unintended consequences. Well, first of all, let's just reiterate that you're saying that primarily what parents are seeing when they see a child that they call a fussy eater is not fussiness and it's not manipulation primarily. What it is that child's expression of sensitivity. Well, before we go on to how we should respond to it and what the impact is of responding in certain ways, how would it work? Because there'll be parents watching this, for example, who say, okay, but my child won't eat foods of the same colour. That's not to do with texture and sensitivity of taste. What's going on there?
Well, again, going back to sensory properties of foods, right? Food has, in addition to a smell and a taste and a texture, also has a certain visual appearance, right? And so foods of certain colors, you know, some people can be, you know, can see the color blue and feel that's a soothing and calming you know, visual experience that I'm having. I really like blue. Blue makes me feel kind of relaxed. And then I you know, when I eat a blue popsicle or a blueberry,
Yeah.
I really, you know, I'm drawn to that. I really like that. So color can be just as much of a sensory preference or sensitivity as anything
Yeah.
else. And I think it's what can also happen is you get these things also hooked in together. So if a child has an experience of eating a blueberry, perhaps that was really sour, and they had a really intense, strong, horrible reaction to that, to the sensory experience of eating that blueberry, then perhaps anything and everything they see that's put before them on their plate that's blue or that looks in any way like a blueberry, they're going to have this anxiety response to, ooh, that looks like that blueberry.
Yeah.
And sometimes, again, this can be very complex to understand because the family or a parent is thinking, what's the problem? It's not a blueberry, right? It's a there's not as many blue foods that I can think of right now that are examples, but you know, it can seem very confusing and complicated. What's so important to understand is that, you know, again, children can have very strong sensory preferences and sensitivities that can also be over time lessened
Yeah.
and worked through with more exposure. But the most important thing is that the experience that the child has is one of not being pressured and pushed and forced, because as soon as that happens around food, when children have that, I'm being pushed or forced to eat something that already is alarming my central nervous system. I don't feel safe. I'm afraid. I don't want to put this in my body. I don't want to taste this or look at this or touch this. What can happen then is all of those experiences
can be stored in kids' memories and in kids what we call emotional memories.
Yeah.
And then anything that has to do with eating certain foods gets associated with these with a lot of anxiety, a lot of fear, a lot of central nervous system kind of fight or
Yeah.
flight, like I got to get out of here, this is unsafe. So without even realizing these things, I mean, I know for sure that if I had stronger, I mean, I talked about my thing with peas, but if as a neurotypical child, right, if I had had even stronger sensory sensitivities to peas, for example, and my parents had kept pushing and pushed harder and forced and, tried to, shovel the peas into my mouth, I think I would have developed probably a significant eating disorder,
Yeah.
because I would have felt so much
Yeah.
insecurity and trauma around that experience. And so again, parents don't think that through. They're just trying to get food into their kids. They're just trying to help their kids.
So it's really interesting. So what I'm understanding from what you're saying, first of all, it's really important to understand from the child's point of view, not from our point of view, what's going on for them. So whereas we might think something is, as parents, we might think something's unduly fussy, like, the visual appearance of the plate and how the colours are organised and things like this, that might tap in to a sensory issue that the child has. So it's not that they're being difficult, it's not that they're being manipulative, it's just that they're expressing the sensory reaction that they're having. Also with autistic children, I think it's very possible to have the same sort of thing with patterns. So, for example, with my son at the moment, we've got two lights in the living room on either side. If one of them's on and the other's off, he feels very, very uncomfortable about that. And it's not, it would be very easy to think, oh, it's just a silly tick, people would think about it. But actually, that's an equivalent of a sensory issue, and that might be why children are not wanting to have the different colours touching each other on a plate, for example. And then the second thing that you said was about, I guess if we understand that, then it doesn't make sense to force them, because what are we forcing them to do? We'd be forcing them to overcome their real sensory issues. Like, for example, if, as you said, with your peas, you hate peas. If you were forced, if you had a real hatred of peas and you were forced to eat them, it would feel like an act of violation, even as a child, wouldn't it? It would feel like an aggressive act. And suddenly you've got a parent who you look to for your support, for your sense of how to be in the world and to look after you and protect you in the world. And this parent is, in your experience, committing an act of aggression against you. And that's what it is in the child's experience. It's nothing short of that. It's going to, yes, give you an eating disorder, obviously, because, or a big part of it would be to do with the trust issue between the child and the parent. And it's so important to bear that in mind. So if forcing is obviously not the right way to manage this, what is the right way?
Yeah, great question. The first thing that pops into my mind, which is the first thing I always think about and try to help parents do, is take a breath and relax. Your child's going to be okay. And you're going to be okay. And I remember, Guy, I'm picturing right now, there's a certain, there's a wonderful section in your book where you describe some.
I think you're the biggest fan of my book.
I am the number one fan of your book, and because it has so many powerful and relevant examples. Because I'm really literally referencing or remembering a certain point in the book where you talked about helping your son become more open to eating, different foods and eating without the pressure. Right, just feeding himself, because you had gotten into patterns of oh my gosh, we have to put him in front of the TV and we have to do put a spoon, sort of, get the food into him, and he was becoming less and less of an independent, self-motivated eater. And that can be a very dangerous cycle that many families get into, because it seems like the only way is to kind of push the food into my child. And you discovered a different way, and a lot of it had to do, from what I remember, with you just relaxing. And I don't want to speak for you, but it seems like that. Interestingly, when you say what's the path forward, one of the first examples that pops up is what you describe in your book.
I'll put a link to the book in the description, so if anybody is interested, they could get it. But it is important to, as you say, because parents, they love their child, and the reason parents get anxious about food, apart from their own food issues, because everybody in the world's got food issues pretty much.
That's right.
Is because they care about their child and they want their child to survive instinctively. It's nature. And when they see their child not eating, it's a primal fear that is ignited. And so then it becomes desperate, it becomes urgent to get food into the child. And it's a really difficult situation, because if we stay with that anxiety and act on that anxiety in an anxious way, as you described before, we're causing very real damage to the trust of the relationship. And we're not helping the child to survive, because how much food do you actually get into your child by that sort of technique anyway? So it's important to understand it from the parent's point of view, and to offer reassurance that it's hard to find a different way, but a different way has to be found than anxiety, because it's actually making that every time there's a stressful situation about food, it's giving the child, whereas before the child didn't have a food issue, the child had a sensory issue that was just coming up when they ate. And rather than managing the sensory issue, we treat it as a food issue, and we pressure the child to eat. Every time we do that, we're giving the child a bigger and bigger food issue, which they didn't have at the beginning. So yeah, it's important to find that other way. So is there anything else you could say about what parents should do?
I think you just said it, Guy. I want there to be a caption on the bottom of the screen that says, it's not a food issue or an eating issue, it's a sensory issue. And then, with the best of intentions, because of our own primal fear, right, we turn it into an eating and food issue.
Yeah.
Or we make it worse. And so I think it's so much more powerful when you say, as a parent, that sort of primal fear, right, of oh my gosh, my child's not going to survive. I have to get nutrients into them, or they're not going to survive. That is so primal and so deep. And I think, again, what helps parents get through that is reassurance that their child is going to be okay, and that their child is not going to wither away, and perhaps starve, or go for weeks and weeks and weeks without eating, or oh my gosh, is only going to eat crisps for the rest of his life, and then therefore have severe health issues. And like, parents can work themselves up into a frenzy about that. And I think what we're saying is, that's where things start to come off the rails in terms of some of these patterns, really unhealthy and dangerous patterns getting established. So that's why I say it's easy for me to say, just relax, because it's not my child. I'm not the one who's experiencing that intense primal fear. Yeah. But I think that's a necessary path forward. And I would say that there are professionals who are feeding specialists who really understand that and can really help parents and work with parents through that. There's also people that consider themselves feeding specialists that use a much more, I would say, pressured kind of system of external rewards and consequences that can exacerbate a lot of these issues, because again, they're treating the wrong thing. They're treating things. Yes, go ahead.
No. So what? Just remind us, what sort of specialist is it the parents should look for?
Well, it's very tricky, Guy, because it's not. There's no. I mean, the discipline. There's sort of pediatric feeding specialists, right? That this is kind of supposedly what they've been trained in or what they specialize in. But I think more what's important to really determine is what kind of approach the specialist is using. Are they using more traditional behavioral methods of rewarding children who are, eating desirable foods, or taking a bite of something and then everybody says, "Good job, that's so wonderful," or they get access to their iPhone or whatever it is after they take a bite of a less preferred or less desirable food? Again, the problem with those approaches is they're not actually addressing the issue. Like you described so eloquently. We're not talking about a behavioral issue. We're talking about a much deeper central nervous system sensory issue. So, what's so interesting is if you can get a child to eat a certain food, if they're going to get access to their preferred thing to get you to just finally leave them alone but that doesn't have lasting impact on shifting a child's sensory sensitivities.
No.
That's
and it
a very
damages the
temporary
relationship
fix
with the parent as well.
Yes.
And
exactly.
I think maybe if people have watched this and they resonate with what we're saying, all it would take, I guess, is a conversation with the specialist to ask them what sort of approach they use, and just from the language that they use, the parent will be able to make a good judgment as to whether that treatment is suitable for the child or not.
Yes, I completely agree, Guy. And again, what I've seen in a lot of my travels in the field are that when people are not thinking about what you described, which is the sensory issue being primary, as well as the relationship and the trust with the parent being primary, that if someone's not working with those two things primarily, and they're focusing just on techniques of again, using rewards to get a child to eat food that they don't want to eat, that's not going to have lasting success. And it's also potentially going to make things worse in terms of the relationship, as you described, with the parent and the sensory issues.